Welcome, everybody. My name is Terry Swartz-Russell. I am the Director of Family and Adult Education at Temple Emmanuel. Tonight's program is sponsored by our Death Cafe initiative, which started actually before COVID when we saw people in person, and has been going strong with lots of different topics and presenters since then, including through COVID when things were worse. We welcome back tonight's speaker, Margie Sokol, who taught us previously, and we wanted her to return, and here she is. And tonight's topic is Jewish teachings on the afterlife. And Margie is the director of the Betty Ann Greenbaum Miller Center for Jewish Healing, and also the director of Spirituality and Aging at Jewish Family and Children's Services in the Boston area. We welcome back Margie. We want everybody to stay on mute, so please mute yourself. If not, I can mute everybody. Following Margie's presentation, we will have questions and answers. So stick around, and I'm going to turn it over to Margie. Everybody else should be muted, including me. Selma, please mute.
Okay, thank you, Terry. And I really am delighted to be back with all of you. The last time I was here, it was last September 2020. And following that discussion, folks said maybe we could talk about the afterlife next time because I raised the issue. And I said, sure. So it's a huge topic, a really, really big topic, and one that I feel really, really passionate about. So I really am delighted to be here. And I have to say that I am not a scholar. I'm not a theologian. I'm a practitioner. My background is in social work, and I'm a practitioner. This is a topic that I care about deeply, and I'll share why. But it's something I've thought about my whole life, actually. And because I've been at Jewish Family and Children's Service for 27 years, I've had the fortune to talk about this topic with, thank you, Terry, with so many people. So it's been through my work and my friends and my family that I've had the opportunity to talk, but I've never presented in this way. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing with you what I know and what I learned. So I was supposed to offer this presentation last March, but last March I had COVID. So I had to cancel, and I was disappointed. But since that time, my mom, Zichrona Livracha, is died of blessed memory. My mother died in June. And so how the world works, how things happen, I feel in some ways more invested in this topic, having gone through it so personally with my own mother, as opposed to the other things that I would have shared before she died. So I want to say that, people, and I want to thank all my friends and colleagues who showed up. I just want to say that because a few of my friends and colleagues from JF and CS are here, and it's nice to have friendly faces, as well as all of you who made the time to come out at 7:45 at night on Zoom. So I hope that we can have it be a little bit interactive. I will offer opportunities for people to unmute even before the end, to put questions in the chat. We'll see how it goes. But, I can't tell you how many times people have told me I didn't know that Judaism or Jews believe in the afterlife. I didn't know that existed. I was never taught that. So it's actually not what Jews believe. It's what Judaism has to say to teach us about this topic. And Judaism has a lot to say about this topic. Traditional Judaism forever talked about this topic. It's only in more recent times, and the disconnection and the dislocation of Jews, that so many of our things that were once just givens have been lost to us. But the good news is we can reclaim it now. I mean, I'm going to be sending out you some resources tomorrow. There's so much out there now. There's websites, there's books, things that didn't exist so many years ago. So it's if you're interested, and I assume you are because you've showed up, there's a lot out there. Before I begin about the afterlife, I want to say that one of the things I have been doing most of my career is talking about death and dying and grief and loss. And I love that Temple Emmanuel hosts a death cafe because I actually got a certificate from the National Center for Death Education, a certificate in thanatology, which is the study of death and dying. But when I would tell people I got it from the National Center for Death Education, they didn't even hear the word death. They thought I said DEAF, deaf. Oh, I didn't know you know sign language, Margie. No, I don't. Although the letters I learned when I was little. But no, people couldn't even hear the word death. They would hear another word. Because we don't use the word death. We don't, as George Carlin, the comedian, says, we're not going to die. We're going to expire like a subscription to a magazine. We'll pass away. We'll float away somewhere. And so often when I give talks about death and loss and grief, I say, you know, we actually don't use the word death. We don't hear it much related to actual dying. We hear these other euphemisms. And yet, how ironic that we do use the word death all the time. And I often ask people to put it in the chat. I'm not going to do that now, but I'm just going to give you a few hints. Dead end, deadbeat, deadline, dead ahead, dead as a doornail, things, let's let things die down. The phone died. And recently I gave a talk and I said, and I made a whole list and I said, does anyone have anything to add? And someone put in the chat, drop dead gorgeous. I just thought that was, you know, I started laughing. I thought that, yeah, these are the ways we use the word. So that's my spiel about our death to dying culture. Years ago, I heard Thomas Lynch, who was an advisor to the television show 6 Feet Under. How many of you that I can see on this? Thank you, Elise Cohen, Kick the Bucket. Yeah, that's another, love that. So 6 Feet Under was a HBO series about a funeral family that owned a funeral home. And Thomas Lynch was an advisor. And I heard him speak at a conference, and he death warmed over. I love that one. And I heard him speak, and he said, you know, 100 years ago, people died in their homes. The funeral parlor was in the home, including in Jewish homes. The death that was in the home, and the outhouse was outside. Now we've taken the outhouse, and he used some not so lovely words. We've brought it into the house. And we've taken death out of the house and shoved it away so that we don't see it in our culture. But that's new. That isn't how it's been since the beginning of time. Children grew up seeing it around them. It was part of life. It was part of just the generations being together. So we have really removed it. And if I was to ask you right now, when was the first time you experienced a death, just to think about it in your own life? When was the first time? And what was that even like for you? How old were you when that first death happened in your life? And then the second question is, when was the first time you ever went to a funeral? Was it for that person or not? And when we think about these things, some people haven't gone to a funeral until they're in their 40s. You know, I hear this all the time. We're living longer. Things, you know, people have different experiences. So just thinking about your own experience. And that's why I want to say right now, what I'm going to keep talking about, it's a hard topic. People are going to have different reactions. And people are here tonight for all different reasons. And if we were in person and we had a few hours, the conversations we could have with each other would be amazing. Because so much about that is sharing our stories. How many places do we even have to have a conversation like this in our culture? And I commend Arza and Terry for creating this space to talk about these topics. And there are death cafes across the country. So this is just such a wonderful new movement towards having conversations about what we human beings actually do think about. So if you need to keep your camera off, that's fine. whatever ways you need to take care of yourself. So as I said, I've been thinking about this topic my whole life. And the only reason I know that one of the reasons I got into this field and that I was really wanted to know about the afterlife was because I was just very afraid of death. Very afraid of death, my own death and the death of people I loved. I thought about it a lot. I could ask for raise of hands if people had those experiences. Not everybody does. That's the other thing. Not everybody has the same, thank you, Arza, raised her hand. Not everybody has the same experiences. Because I do talk about this with a lot of people. People are different. But I was thinking about my mortality and the mortality of others when I was very young. And I attribute it to a couple of things. And I invite you to think about your own stories. My mother had me when she was 19, and I was her first. So she was very, very young. And someone gave her a baby book, and she wrote in the baby book. And this is my mother's handwriting from the baby book. I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts. When I was 18 months old, and by the way, I come across looking really good as a baby in this baby book. She was 19, she wanted to have the perfect baby, right? So when I was 18 months old, I don't remember this at all. This is interesting. I love animals. I don't remember this. And what I'm going to read you, that's why when we think about some kinds of trauma, sometimes things happen that we don't remember. But I always loved the name Michael, and I didn't know why. So at 18, we bought a dog named Michael. This is my mother's words. Margie called him Geikel. She followed him all over the house. She fed him at least half of her food. She asked for cookies to give him. She just adored him. And she was unhappy if he was out of the house for a minute. He was a full-grown boxer, but as little as Margie was, she wasn't afraid, and she hugged him and petted him all day. Sometimes he accidentally knocked her down, but she didn't mind. She cried every time. So this is the sad part. She cried every time she heard something at the door when we finally had to get rid of him because he was tearing up lawns in the neighborhood. So that sadness of an 18-month-old who loved this dog, and it disappeared. Okay? So it disappeared. And in an 18-month child's mind, what happened to that dog? Which, of course, nobody talked to me about. That's what's called an ambiguous loss. A death loss is one thing, and ambiguous loss is so many of the losses we've had during COVID. These are living losses. It can be anything. It can be, a job that's no longer there. It can be refugees. It can be immigration. It can be a change in our situation. Those are ambiguous losses. Those are living losses. So then the next thing in the baby book is questions pertaining to sex. And this is where it begins, where I started thinking about the afterlife. I was 4. And my Zadie, my booby, died when I was 2. Okay? My Zadie, my great-grandfather, I'm sorry. My Zadie, my great-grandfather, died when I was 2. So my mother wrote in my book when I was 4, Margie is quite interested in who takes care of babies and puts them together in mummies and tummies, and how their arms and legs are attached before they get into mummies' tummies. Margie wonders if God in heaven, that helps mummy and daddies to have babies, lives in the same heaven where her Zadie went. So I'm 4 years old now, and my mother is writing this, and for 2 years I have wondered where Zadie went. So my first loss, my first death when I was 2 years old, I wasn't even 2 yet actually, I remember my Zadie, and they say, oh, kids don't remember, blah, blah, blah. Well, there are kids that do, and I remember, and it's not much, but I remember him. I remember being with him. And so for 2 years, I'm wondering where Zadie went. And I'm asking my mother, and she says he lives in heaven where God is. But to a 4-year-old, heaven could be New York City. A 4-year-old doesn't typically understand death in that way. When I think when you're told that God is in heaven, God could be anywhere. Miami Beach. So that's at 4. 2 years I've been thinking about where did Zadie go? This Zadie that I loved, and my booby. She lived for many more years, my great-grandmother. Now I'm 6. All right, so now I'm 6, and this is the last one I'm going to be reading to you. And this is called Questions Pertaining to Religion. So now I'm 6 years old, and my mother's father dies. Now my mother is 24 years old when her beloved father dies. She's pregnant with her 3rd child. I'm 6, my brother's 4, my mother's pregnant. And I was very close to my Papa Israel from Lithuania. So now this is my 3rd loss. Margie asked where she was when I was in school. This is about religion. I told her that she was being taken care of by God. Now she asks all kinds of questions like, did God put this together, and did God do that? And at 4, she wants to know if Zadie, now she's going back in time, if Zadie is coming back from heaven. Is Zadie coming back? She can't quite understand at 5 how God is everywhere. And now I'm 6 years old, and Papa Israel died. Margie was very upset, as they were very close. She said she first wanted to see him one more time. So that's really sad. That's really sad. And children, up until more recently, were always involved with death and dying, and they were around, and they were there for funerals and shivas. They would see dead bodies in their house. And we are the ones that have been so separated from it. I never went to any of these people's funerals. I never set shiva with anybody. All they did was disappear from my life. And I know that is one of the reasons that I became so obsessed with death. Now, my mother, as years went by, I used to talk to her about the afterlife, and she would say, Margie, dead is dead. Dead is dead. That was it. And I'd say, I don't find that comforting. Okay. But she said, because the reason I believe that, Margie, is because if there is an afterlife, my father would have come back to me. He would have given me a sign. So I accepted that until years later, it finally dawned on me. He did come back. He gave me the signs. I felt his presence my whole childhood. I felt his presence through my adolescence. Children are much more open to this. We just don't have the words. And if it's not reinforced by the people around us, then we don't have words for it. And it was only much later that I said to my mother, Mom, he was with me. I felt his presence. I talked to him. And the reason he didn't come to you, Mom, is because you were so bereaved. And my mother was absolutely bereaved through her whole life with the loss of her father. So that's how I want to begin. And I want to just ask, I see there are a couple of things in the chat, but if there's anybody who wants to even put in the chat when you had your first loss or your first funeral, so that we can just see what's out there. In the meantime, I'm going to take a breath. And so my good friend Barbara Gaffin says we're in trouble if God lives in Miami Beach. I love that. So if people want to put something in the chat about that, I'm just going to leave that open. All right. So that's the first part, where it all started, why I'm interested in this topic. So next, there are books out there, big books, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. How many of you have seen this book? I've got some nod. Yeah, awesome. Okay. It's a very thick book. This is the 3rd edition. And I'm going to send all these resources so you'll have them if you want them. This is from Rabbi Simcha Paul Raphael. I'm just going to read a brief beginning that he says at the beginning, which is very interesting. For those of you who know Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, who was a very big influence on my life and his writings. He was the founder of the Jewish renewal movement of Aleph. And Reb Zalman encouraged Simcha Paul Raphael to write this. And this is the third edition, to write this. And it was a scholarly, yes, thank you, Elise. She wrote it to everyone, and I just want to read that. My hamster died when I was 9, and my Nana died when I was 16. I was very affected by this, as we were very close. Exactly. Thank you so much, Elise, for sharing that. Animals are huge losses and need to be mourned. And of course, the loss at 16. So what he talks about is that when he says, this is how Simcha opens up. At the age of 4, I encountered death for the first time when my maternal grandmother suddenly disappeared from my life. Faced with the absence of a person who had been a deep source of love and nurturance, I probably questioned all the adults around me to her whereabouts. Where is Grandma? He's 4. In response to my innocent yet persistent inquiries, I was told that Bubby had died and gone to heaven. Doesn't this sound similar? And this is the guy that did his PhD and then wrote a doctorate and wrote this book. Similar longing and yearning to find the answers. However, no one explained to me exactly why she died or why she left without even saying goodbye. So he talks about praying to her every night and feeling her presence. And the other person I want to share, I'm sure that many of you have heard of Rabbi Art Green. So he wrote the foreword to this third edition. He's the rector at the Rabbinical School at Hebrew College. Writes a lot about mysticism and Hasidism. How many of you have heard of Rabbi Art Green? All right, so we have a few. And he has a beautiful foreword to the book. But what I want to read is the end. His mom died when he was 11, so he also knows from the loss at an early age. And he writes that he had to sort of just move forward in his life in order to cope. So at the end of his foreword, he writes, I am not a believer or a cynic. I don't know, I'm neither. The words that I write are neither as a believer nor as a cynic. Early in my adult life, I found that acceptance of the finality of death was important to my own psychic survival. So I want to emphasize that I'm just sharing with you as I go forward what Judaism has to say, but that whatever works for you is what matters. Whatever brings you comfort is what matters. Whatever you decide to pick and choose, or I don't like that, or I don't believe, I'm not here to convince anybody. I'm here just to share what different things are being offered. So that's why I wanted to read Rabbi Art Green, because he says he had to accept the finality of death because his mother died when he was 11. But then he goes on to write that I had to declare that I was an agnostic with regard to all that I had been taught or heard about the afterlife, because he grew up in a traditional home. He grew up hearing all about the afterlife, and his grandmother, who had lost her son and her daughter, was very upset because she didn't have what's called a Pastoral. A Pastoral is someone who says Kaddish after someone dies, and in the traditional observant Jewish community, it's a boy, a man, and so he was the Pastoral. He had to become the one to fill that space. So he grew up in a world dealing with a lot of death. He said, but as I've gotten older and I've lost a lot of people, and so he grew up with the afterlife as just a given. As I grew older and I lost people I loved and perhaps became a tad wiser, I learned that the after and afterlife existed in a realm quite beyond time, and that when speaking of souls, we were dwelling in a dimension in which distinctions belonging to the rational intellect, including present versus absent, here versus there, and before versus after, didn't really apply. Agnostic I remain, but more humbly so. I just think that's beautiful. Agnostic he remains, but more humbly so. I have begun to learn how much there is that I don't know. This is coming from an expert in mysticism. And he ends with, some of it, however, you may learn from reading and contemplating the book before you. So I'm not here to sell the book. In fact, it's quite dense. In scholarly and awesome. But I wanted to read you sort of what these other folks had to say about this topic, which feels different perspectives. Okay, now I'm going to take a breath. And just to give you a moment, I appreciate that Elise shared about her hamster. I love that. And about your Nana, and that you were very close. And to lose a Nana at 16 is very hard. And so I just want to give people a moment to take a breath and just think about their own experiences. It's important to think about our losses. It's important to think about our loss line, as some call it, to sort of, it's an opportunity to sort of incorporate all of this in our story. And sometimes as we get older, we see things in different ways. If we had an opportunity to spend a couple of days together, I'm sure we would so want to hear each other's stories of different losses that we've experienced in our life, of people we felt attached to. How many of you have heard of Brene Brown? Okay, good. All right. It's a good crowd. She recently, I'll put it in the thing as well, but she recently interviewed Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor who wrote 2 books, awesome books, one called The Choice and one called The Gift. She was in Auschwitz as a teenager. And in this podcast, she said something that I really liked. She said, most therapy is grief work. Most therapy is grief work. But this is the most important line. It's not what happened to you. It's what didn't happen. It's what didn't happen. And so years later, when I sort of went back to sort of think about the loss of my grandfather when I was 6, I realized it was in my early 50s, I went to therapy, and I realized that I was frozen in that picture of my mother screaming and crying because her dad died and she was 24 and pregnant and had 2 other kids. And so I realized, and I always felt so badly for my poor mother, but I realized I was 6 and there was no one there to care for me. It's not what happened. It's my papa died. It's what didn't happen, that no one supported me. And so this is important when we think about children, grandchildren, ourselves, that we need to give ourselves that love, that comfort, to be able to grieve the losses. We don't talk about that in our culture as well. But grief is a really important thing that to feel. When we feel love and we feel attached, that's the price we pay, is that we grieve. So now I'm going to do some Torah study. So I'd like to just say the blessing over the Torah study, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kirishanu b'mitzvotzav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. I have a nice translation here. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, instilling in us the holiness of mitzvot by commanding us to engage with words of Torah. So, the first words of Torah that I want to share about the afterlife, that really is sort of how I understand Torah, is from one of my teachers, Rabbi Amy Alberg. Rabbi Amy Alberg was the first woman ordained in the conservative movement in 1985. She was also one of the women rabbis who was the founders of the Jewish healing movement back in the early 90s. And I consider myself part of that Jewish healing movement. Many of those folks have been my teachers. And Amy Alberg was also worked in hospice and end of life. And so this is another book. I have a lot of books. This is Jewish Pastoral Care, a practical handbook. So this is actually written more for rabbis and chaplains. So when you think about it, she's teaching them, and she writes about the afterlife in her chapter on caring for the dying and their loved ones. Here's what she has to say about the afterlife. It's remarkable how many of our people have lost contact with our traditions, rich teachings on life after death. Perhaps just as remarkably, in our generation, there is a great hunger for this wisdom, particularly among those facing death. It is in my experience that people with a strong afterlife belief usually have an easier time making their way making their way toward the time of death. They have an easier time if they have a belief. Not everybody, but she's saying that's what she's experienced. So it's a great mitzvah to respond to people's questions about the afterlife, or even to ask whether this is a part of a person's belief. Again, she's talking to chaplains and rabbis. I find it most powerful to begin by asking the person what he or she believes about what happens to us after we die, or whether he or she has ever had an experience or contact with someone who had died. We're talking about experiences with people who have died, and whether or not people have had that kind of soul communication. She goes on to say there are so many versions of Jewish afterlife belief that almost any image that a person believes in can be located in Jewish teaching. And I'm just going to stop here for a second, because in my 30s, when I didn't know that Judaism had this whole belief system, I was like most people, and I was still obsessing about what happened. I turned to Buddhism, and this is not uncommon. A lot of people turn to Buddhism because it's appealing. There's reincarnation, there's all these different things, and so I read a lot about that, the Tibetan Book of the Dying, etc. I had no clue that Judaism believed in the things that I'm talking about this evening, and that's not uncommon. People turn to other traditions. But we can tell the person that their tentatively held belief, is this a little crazy? Meaning I had a communication with someone who had died, or the feeling I had for years that my grandfather was with me. And so when a person says to the rabbi or chaplain, is this crazy? You can say no. It has ancient roots in Jewish thought. And so learning that Judaism teaches that life continues after the grave can be a great source of comfort. That's what she has to say to the rabbis about the afterlife. I read that years ago and I was so happy. In the next chapter in this book, it's on grief and bereavement, and that chapter happens to be written by that rabbi I just mentioned, Rabbi Simcha Paul Raphael, that wrote that very thick book on Jewish views of the afterlife. So this he wrote about 20 years ago, and this is what I want to read to you now. In the early phase of the grief journey, at the beginning, after a death, according to Jewish tradition, it's said that the soul of the deceased may be confused, unaware whether it's still alive or departed from the world. This is the hard stuff. This phase of the post-mortem journey is called Chibut HaKever, the pangs of the grave, and is described in Jewish sources as a process of 3 to 7 days of the gradual separation of the soul from the body. 3 to 7 days. And when we think about Shiva, and when we think about all of that, it fits in perfectly with our traditions of mourning after a person dies. And during this phase of the 3 to 7 days right after death, the disembodied being undergoes a process of purification that enables it to give up attachments to the physical realm. For those beings, I love this one, who are attached to the physical existence and material things, the process of separation can be more painful. And this disembodied soul according to the Zohar, which is a mystical book written during the Middle Ages. It's like the source of Jewish mysticism. It says in the Zohar, the disembodied soul wanders about the world, suffering the judgments of the grave, chibut hakever, wandering about the world and beholds the body, which was once its home, devoured by worms. I don't love that part. I don't tend to particularly focus on that, but it is a time of sort of beginning of judgment and thinking about the judgment of the soul. And it talks about death as being like drawing out a hair out of milk. So the process of death is not painful, but there's a time of purification. And that time is typically 12 months. And that's why we say there's a year of mourning for parents for 12 months, for a year. For other losses, it's 30 days. But for our parents who brought us into this world, it's a year. But we only say Kaddish for 11 months because it's only the really, wicked one. I don't like that word, but the ones who have to stay there a month longer and have the soul and be in that time of purification until they go up to the world to come. In Judaism, so this is an important thing. I mean, you could call it purgatory or you could call it Gehinnom, which is, some people would call that, it's like not hell, like in Christianity, but it's a place of undergoing purification, a life review, a time of sort of acknowledging the things that we did wrong. So it's not like, it's a time of purification. And but it's not a time, I mean, it's typically not described as a time that's so horrible. It's a time of purification to then eventually ascend to what we call in Judaism, heaven is called two terms. One is called the world to come, Olam Haba, and the other is Gan Eden, Garden of Eden. So when you think about the Garden of Eden and that as a place of heaven, it's a place where before Adam and Eve ate the apple, when it was all pure innocence, how lovely that the rabbis call that place of heaven Gan Eden, of heaven, Gan Eden. And the world to come, sometimes it is referred to right after the death, like I said, within 11 months, going up there to the world to come. But it's also referred to at the end of days. So this is where Judaism, why it's so complicated. We also have a notion of resurrection at the end of days. This is bodily resurrection, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the world to come can also be referred to that as well. Now, about a year and a half ago, I went to a conference on suicide loss. It's a topic I've also been very interested in because my mother suffered some mental health issues throughout my life, and when I was 19, she made a very serious suicide attempt. Another reason I've been interested in this topic, and luckily she survived for many years, but she did have her struggles. And so right now through Jewish Family, we are actually offering a suicide loss group, which is with the help of CJP, and I'm co-facilitating with Rabbi Suzanne Offit, that I know some of you know, and she's presented here as well. And so I feel really strongly about the importance of talking about these things and to keep learning. So I'm at the conference. It's a year and a half ago, 2 years. It was in person. And one of the speakers who I very much admire, who I won't name him, but he got up there in front of almost 200 people talking about suicide and made the statement that Jews don't believe in heaven. How many of you that are on my screen have heard that before, that Jews don't believe in heaven? Okay. Oh, thank you. That's just on this screen. So my heart started beating really, really, really fast. And I I knew I had to get up, and I raised my hand, and he knew who I was because I had introduced myself during lunch. I told him where I worked. He probably didn't want to call on me because he just said Jews don't believe in heaven. And I just stood up, and when he took a breath, and I said, and my heart was beating so fast, I said, I understand that you said that, and maybe there are some people believe that, but it's not true. Judaism believes in heaven, and I just wanted to let you all know that. And then I sat down. Whatever I said, I have no idea what I said, but there were people around me. One of my colleagues, Mary, was there, and you go, girl. And I said that because I felt like, wow, this is what people keep hearing, and I felt like I couldn't live with myself if I didn't say that. And then he said afterwards, well, Margie should know because she works at Jewish Family and Children's Service, which I thought was very funny. So anyway, that's my story about why I feel it's so important to talk about this, to let people know that if they want to believe in this, there's lots out there. And I'm going to continue because, as Rabbi Amy Alberg said, it provides a lot of comfort for some people. In fact, in the world of, so I'm going to continue. If anybody has any questions or comments before I continue. Okay. Oh, this is good. Okay, so that's a great question. So Beth said, I always heard that Judaism doesn't emphasize an afterlife, but focuses on righteous action during life. Excellent. That's right. You're not going to go to a funeral and hear the person is in a better place. You're not going to, that is because we believe it's this world, which is called Olam Hazeh. Olam Hazeh, this world, as opposed to Olam Haba, the next world. So this is the world where we can do good deeds, where we can do mitzvot, where we can work together with God, with tikkun olam, to repair our world. It's also important to do tikkun atzmi, self-repair, self-healing. So this is in conjunction with working together to heal our world. And we do that through mitzvahs, through mitzvot, being, doing good deeds. So the emphasis, yes, is being in this world, but we also hold the tradition that there is another world at the same time. So every morning in our prayers, we have a prayer, and I actually have taught this a lot over the years because one of the things I do a lot with congregation is talk about the mitzvah of visiting the sick, bikor cholim. In the prayer book, it says, these are the things that have no prescribed measure, in which the fruits a person enjoys in this world, the fruits of what I'm going to tell you, a person enjoys in this world, but whose principle remains intact for him in the world to come. So there is some sense of reward, as it were. We don't do it for that reason, but here it says we are here getting the fruits in this world and in the world to come. And what are they? Honoring our father and mother, acts of kindness, I love this, early attendance at the house of study, hospitality to guests, being hospitable, like our foremother and father, Abraham and Sarah. Visiting the sick is included, providing for a needy bride, escorting the dead, etc. So even though we are focused on this world, and I'm going to end with what Beth asked about, sort of showing the dichotomy between the two, that we can hold the two at the same time. And also in other prayers, just to continue as long as I'm looking at the prayer book, lots of references to Mechayat HaMetim, revival of the dead at the end of times, in the Amida, the standing prayer, the silent prayer, 18 blessings, references to, okay. So I'm going to take a break, and I will go back to what she asked. Okay. So Judith asks, it's my understanding that in pre-rabbinic Judaism, we didn't believe in an afterlife, probably from fear of worshiping the dead. Yes, Judith knows her stuff, as neighboring pagans did. However, by rabbinic times, the idea of an afterlife was accepted. Certainly, the Talmud has stories of rabbis in discussion in heaven. Absolutely. So that chronology, which Judith has just shared, is true. In the Bible, in the 5 books, there is a place that's referred to as Sheol, which is sort of like a place under the earth. They don't know exactly, a pit. Everyone goes there. There's no reward or punishment. It's just sort of a place. And why is there not an emphasis on the afterlife? So many of the scholars, like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, etc., say it was because we Jews were surrounded by a death culture in Egypt. Ancient Egypt, it was all about pyramids. The pyramids were portals to the afterlife. And though there were those who said that the Jewish slaves were building those pyramids. And so the whole culture was about bringing the food and the material things so the pharaohs would go to the next world. There's a whole Egyptian Book of the Dead. The whole culture was focused on death. And so the Hebrew Bible was in a counter to that. It was about life. It was about being in this world. And so there was not an emphasis about the afterlife in the 5 books of Moses, although there are those who say there were references, because for some of the great ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, these are all mentioned as being gathered to their ancestors, to their kin, that when they died, they were gathered to their kin. And so there were those who say that these are references to the afterlife. And there are those who don't. So, there's both and. But thank you, Judith, for that comment, because it's true that it really only began with Rabbinic Judaism, which is the time after the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, the Common Era. Before that, there was the 2 different sects, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the elite. They were in control of the temple. They did not believe in an afterlife. The Pharisees did, and those folks eventually became Rabbinic Judaism. And the thing was, when you have seen so much destruction and death and the horror of the destruction of the temple, the rabbi, they thought that was the end. And so part of it, and the Talmud, that was an oral tradition originally, passed on from person to person to person. Oh, I'm going to go to Kathy in a minute. Passed on from oral tradition and Jewish tradition. I love that. It was passed on for generations and generations since the beginning of time, as it were. Eventually, the rabbis realized if we don't write down the oral tradition and what's now called the Talmud, we will lose everything. And so there are some cultures that are oral traditions, and when they face some genocide and all these horrible things, they lose so much. So the rabbis, that they figured it out to write it down over centuries, from like the 2nd century to the 5th, the Talmud has so many references to the stories of the rabbis, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So Kathy said she was told that Jews don't believe in an afterlife. Jews believe that people live on in our memory, which of course is true. That's what we hear all the time. And we hear it at funerals, and we hear it everywhere. So that is also true. People live on in our memories. So why is it that as I'm talking to you, I have my great-grandmother's picture here? Because I was named after her. In Ashkenazi tradition, we're named after people who've died. In Sephardic tradition, they also name after people who are living. But I have, of course, they live on in our memory. This is what, and Judaism is all about memory. And we remember those through our prayers, through lighting candles. On the yurt site, I brought the candle and the memory of those, so they continue in our memories. But we also have lots of teachings on the afterlife. So when my mother died, I asked the rabbi to talk about the afterlife at the funeral and at the Shiva. I wanted people to know that if they want to believe, they can also believe in that as well. And they agreed to do that. Someone else put something in the chat. Anybody have any other questions? We remember them by honoring. Oh, I love that. Love that. We remember them by honoring them and carry on their legacies. That's absolutely beautiful. I couldn't agree more. And since my dad died in 2010, I've been doing so much ancestry to be able to know the story and the narrative. So many of us don't know because of the dislocation. We only can go back a couple of generations because so many of us have ancestors that were running from anti-Semitism, pogroms. They got on ships 100 years ago, and they didn't pass on, many of them didn't, the stories because they were just trying to survive in the new land. And so many of us have had to sort of recreate and reclaim those narratives and legacies. The good news is, if it interests you, so much stuff is online now. We're very fortunate, Ancestry.com, etc. I want to go on to what are some of the things that it says, as Judith said, in Rabbinic Judaism. So in the Talmud, in Pirkei Avot, which is the ethics of the fathers or the ethics of the ancestors, some of you, these are things that we read traditionally on Shabbat between Passover and Shavuot for 6 weeks. And there are things like Hillel said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? And so these are wise sayings that our rabbis during the rabbinic period wrote down, and they're part of the Talmud. Who is wise? That's another one I love. Those who learn from other people. So one of them in there is Rabbi Yaakov. This is what he said. This world is like a lobby. Guess what the word for lobby is in Hebrew? Prosdor. How many of you went to Prosdor? Yay, Terry. So the Prosdor Hebrew High School, that is the word the rabbis use for the corridor between this world and the next world. I love that when I learned that. So this world is like a lobby before the world to come. Prepare yourself in the lobby so that you may enter the banquet hall. How's that for an image? In the Talmud, there's lots of images of the world to come. Some of them have people eating, drinking, some of them don't, but I love that image of the banquet hall. The next thing that this rabbi said, and this goes back to what Beth said, and this goes back to what has been asked about sort of holding the two, living in this world and knowing that there's another world. At least in traditional Judaism, this statement in Pirkei Avot, in the ethics of the ancestors, sums it up. The same rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov, used to say, better 1 hour of repentance and good deeds in this world than the entire world to come. I'm going to read that again. Better 1 hour of repentance, 1 hour of repenting and good deeds in this world than the entire world to come. So the focus is on this world, doing good deeds, repenting, saying we're sorry, ask for forgiveness. And then he says in the same breath, and better 1 hour of spiritual bliss in the world to come than the entire life of this world. Better 1 hour of spiritual bliss in the world to come than the entire life of this world. So we need to hold both. He's saying both, and hold both tensions. And so much what some of the rabbis would say about this particular quote is that the emphasis now in this world is thinking about how do we cultivate our souls, our soul in this world through good deeds, through actions of kindness, of being there for others, knowing that we're part of a community, knowing that part of being in a community is that the tradition of saying Kaddish is that we need 10 people, which I find so comforting, so that we know we're not alone in our times of sorrow. Another one from the image of what the world to come looks like. This is from the Zohar, and I really love this one. This is my favorite. This is my favorite because I find it comforting. I understand if you don't. But this is from the Zohar, the mystical book within Judaism, of Kabbalah, the mystical tradition. At the hour of a person's departure from the world, and I'm going to pause here because I love the word departure. I'm going to show you another book. This is called The Deathbed Wisdom of the Hasidic Masters. This was edited by Rabbi Sarah Pasha Orlo. Some of you may know her. She is the head of the whole chaplaincy program at Hebrew Senior Life. And she wrote it with Rabbi Joel Barron, another rabbi. And the foreword is by the same Rabbi Arthur Green, who I read to you before about his mom dying when he was 11. So that's what the rabbis called it back in the day, back in Hasidic times. They called it the Book of Departure. This is an actual book that Rabbi Sarah Pasha Orlo and Joel translated. It was written in Hebrew originally in the 1940s, the Book of Departure. And they talk about it as caring for people at the end of life. But I just thought that was such an awesome word, the Book of Departure. So that's why I'm getting back to what it says here in the Zohar from the mystical tradition. At the hour of a person's departure from the world, his father and relatives gather round him, and he sees them and recognizes them, and likewise all of whom he associated with in this world, and they accompany his soul to the place where it is to abide. So the ancestors gather around, and they're there, according to the Zohar, when a person departs from this world, and the soul recognizes them and sees them, and they accompany the soul to the place where it is to abide. Now, I find that comforting, but I've heard other people who maybe don't want to see their spouse, who maybe don't want to see someone that they didn't have good feelings about. Maybe, and there are people who have shared that, I don't want to be reunited with so-and-so. So I'm not Pollyanna-ish at all when it comes to this. But for me, the idea that there's even a possibility that I would see some of these people who I feel very connected to, whatever that is, we don't know what that means even. No one knows what it means. But that's a beautiful image. And that's the image that I brought to my mother. And that's why this presentation, I feel, is in memory of my mother. When she was there for 5 days at the end of her life in the hospital, unbelievable the way they cared for her. My sister and I were allowed to be with her. We were so fortunate because it was a time when the COVID restrictions were lifted at the beginning of June. And I had the good fortune of having this book, which I had bought for my prior presentation to you in March, which I had to cancel. This is a book, again, I'll send it in the resources, Jewish Prayers and Meditations for the Deathbed. May the angels carry you. By the way, we believe in angels. That's another thing which I get to teach people, that we Jews believe in angels. We actually have an angel blessing, which we say at night, every night before we go to bed. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Oriel. And so I love all that. I've always loved angels, and I just thought they were Christian, but actually it came from the Hebrew Bible. The angels that appeared to Abraham and Sarah, etc. So that's May the Angels Carry You. I read from this book to my mother. I kept reading it and rereading it and singing to her with my sister. And I was able to say to my mother, because I believed it in my heart and I wanted this from my mother, Mom, your Papa and Nana are waiting for you. Your parents are waiting for you. Your Papa who died when you were 24, who you love, he's waiting for you. And I said that to her over and over again, and taught and so many of the things in this book. And for me, who has been thinking about this my whole life, the fact that I could be there with my mother and my sister and sing and prayers. And how many of you have heard of the Vidui? The final prayer, yeah. So that's in the book too. And the Vidui, the final prayer at the end of life. We have that in our Jewish tradition as well. And it talks about going to the world to come. It talks about it in the Vidui. The line is, grant me a place in the world to come. This is a translation by Rabbi Amy Alberg. So all of this stuff is part of our tradition, and we can take what has meaning. In fact, Rabbi Amy Alberg was the one who taught me years ago. I went to a conference in New York on end of life, and she talked about the Jewish tradition has what's called death awareness every day, every night, and every day. Because traditionally we say the Shema at the end of life, and it's in the Vidui, the final confessional prayer. I was looking for the translation in English. The Vidui is the final confessional prayer in Jewish tradition. And we say the Shema in that. But also at night, when we go to bed at night, we say the Shema because we're not sure. We don't take it for granted that we're going to wake up in the morning. That's why when we do wake up, we say, Moda'ani lefanecha. Thank you, God, for giving me back my soul. There is a tradition that the soul's kind of flying around out there while we're sleeping, and we're happy that that soul is back in our body. We say, thank you for giving me back my soul. We don't take it for granted. The thing about the Shema, though, is that and the evening prayers is that there's an idea in Judaism that when we go to sleep is 1/60th of death. So it's like an experience of 1/60th when we sleep, which sometimes I know I was afraid when I was a kid and it was dark. We're also taught that that Shabbat is 1/60th of the world to come. When we observe Shabbat and we stop and we pause, we're taught that that's 1/60th of the world to come. There's another wonderful teaching that when we visit the sick, we take away 1/60th of their pain and suffering. So, and also this I love because I'm into dreams, and there's a lot written about dreams in the Talmud, which is also connected to what we're talking about with the afterlife. The dreams is 1/60th of prophecy. 1/60th of prophecy. So our dreams, at least according to the rabbis, are important messages. And it says that if we don't interpret our dreams, it's like we have a letter that we have not opened. Because the rabbis teach us that there is that sense of connection when we are dreaming, divine connection. Oh, the 1/60th, yeah. So the 1/60th comes from when something is considered kosher. If something drops into a kosher food, 1/60th of whatever that kosher food is, it still remains kosher. So that the rabbis wanted to have, so I don't know where they got 1/60th from, but it comes originally from making sure something's kosher. But if you, by accident, you're cooking a big pot of soup and you drop something in and it's only 1/60th, it's still considered kosher. They took that and then they talked about many things that are 1/60th of the world to come and all those things. So that's where that came from. I don't know where they came up with the 1/60th, but pretty small fraction. Any other questions before we're going to open it up in a minute for questions, like in 5 minutes? Does that sound good? astrology. That's not my particular field. Does Judaism have a perspective on astrology? Well, it's interesting because I was on Kibbutz Beit Alpha when I was 16, and next door was Hefzibah. They have all these tiled floors from back in the day, and there were definitely images in the tiles from the zodiac. So we were influenced by other cultures as well. And so I'm not, that's a whole other field that I don't feel competent to address, except to say that we see those kinds of things that have been preserved in the tiles. Oh, okay. Thank you for Judith, who says 1/60th comes from Babylonian mathematics, which operated on a base 60 system. We use base 10. Whoever understands that, I give you a lot of credit. So thank you. I do want to read this because this goes back to why I got involved in the topic. It tells the story of Rabbah, a 3rd century Babylonian sage, who, as his friend Rabbi Nachman was dying, he requested that he come back and tell him what the passage was like. So after he dies, he appears to Rabbah in a dream, and he says, dying was like a hair being pulled from a cup of milk. I mentioned that at the beginning. Dying was like a hair being pulled from a cup of milk, and yet I would not want to do it again, for the fear of dying is so painful. And that's the fear that we live in our culture. We live in a death-denying culture. We don't talk about these things. It's so important to talk about it in whatever way that people want or need. This was something people talked about as every day because it was part of life. People died. We didn't live the way we're living now. So I just wanted to also say that it shows us in this story between the two rabbis that consciousness persists and that he was communicating with the living. I'm going to end with a children's book, because this is the book that I wish, Resurrection. Sure, I grew up in an Orthodox synagogue. Resurrection is one of the 13, So the language has gone from reform. Even the language of resurrection of the dead, it says Michayei Hakol. It's not about, it says, gives life to everyone. Resurrection, Maimonides had 13 principles that was sort of the faith of what Judaism had to say. One of them was a belief in the resurrection of the dead. Now, a lot of the things that I read, some people believe it literally, some people believe it as a metaphor, but it's definitely a huge belief. That's why lots of people want to be buried in Jerusalem. There's a belief that at the end of days, we don't know what, but eschatology, the end of days, the end of times, whether it's a messianic time, whether it's a person who is a Messiah, that's a very traditional belief, that souls will literally, it's called a Gilgul, they'll be rolling down. The Gilgul is reincarnation, by the way. Reincarnation is a belief in Judaism. It's also in the prayer book, in some prayer books, that at night when we go to bed, we say, I hereby forgive anyone who has hurt me in this Gilgul, this my transmigration, or another one, this incarnation or another one. That's a strong belief of reincarnation. I just want to make sure I share that, as well as the resurrection. So, what's going to happen first? Souls, they say, can split off like a flame. You can have a flame, and then you can go to lots of flames from one flame. There are those that say that the souls can be split off into all these different souls, different reincarnations, different incarnations. It's all there. It's all there in all the teachings that I'm talking about. The resurrection, though, is a time really where the rabbis say the body and the soul will come back together, be resurrected in the land of Israel, and that will be at the end of time. And it's called Mechayei HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. Some of these things have come back, but so much about American Judaism was trying to just fit in, survive, leave behind some of the superstitions that people felt these were superstitions from the old country. So there's a lot written about that, why some of these things would drop. But in our time, people are hungry for this stuff. And so that's why this children's book is called Before You Were Born. This is another traditional belief in Judaism. Before we're born, I'm talking about the afterlife. Now I'm going to talk about what happens before we're born. So I love this book. And this is from the Grinspoon Foundation. How many of you have heard of PJ Library? Yeah, good. This is awesome. So this is one of the books in their collection. One night, when you were little and the moon was full, you climbed into my lap. Tell me a story, you said, about before I was born. And you snuggled closer and listened. And I told you that before you were born, your soul made its home in the highest heaven in the treasury of souls. This is a traditional teaching about what happens before we're born. The treasury of souls. This is not long. It's 2 minutes. The angel Lila, I love that. The angel Lila, I had a cat named Lila, didn't know I was naming her after the angel, watched over you. One day, a heavenly voice went forth, announcing to all the angels that the time had come for you to be born. The pictures are sweet. Then the angel Lila led your soul out of the treasury of souls and brought you down to this world, Olam Hazeh, this world. Once you were here, Lila told your soul to enter a seed. Then Lila brought that seed to your mother, and you started to grow inside her. And while you were growing there, Lila lit a lamp inside your mother's womb and read to you from the book of secrets. As you slept, Lila the angel taught you all the secrets in the world. And she taught you 70 languages, the languages of all the animals, and the language of the wind. By the way, the word wind in Hebrew, ruach, is the same word for soul and for breath, an ancient word for breath. Lila even taught you the history of your soul, and she revealed all the past and the future to you. Most of all, she told you many good stories. And even though you were asleep inside your mother's womb, you listened to all these delightful tales and you loved them. But finally came the time for you to be born. Then the angel Lila led you out into the world. But the moment you were born, Lila put her finger to your lips. Lila put her finger to your lips, reminding you to keep everything that she had taught you a secret. We know now that secrets aren't good, but the ending will be okay. Told you everything she taught you, you should keep a secret. That's how you got the indentation on your upper lip. It is your reminder of all that Lila taught you before you were born and all that you have forgotten. And you ran your finger above your lip, and sure enough, there was an indentation there. But don't worry, you have the rest of your life to learn all those wondrous secrets again. So that's what I offer to you. Wherever you are on your journey, whatever it is that you came here looking for, I offer you that we have the rest of our life to learn the wondrous secrets that are contained in our Jewish tradition. So thank you.
Thank you. That was great. So I know that in between all the conversation, the presentation, that Margie answered a lot of questions that were in the chat. But if anybody has a question who wants to unmute or put it in the chat now, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll conclude. But now's the chance. Okay. So
I do want to mention
yes, please.
the tahara, which, which is, the ritual washing of the body after a person died. The prayers that are said are talking about the soul's journey to the world to come. And I also just want to say, for those who find it meaningful, the Kaddish prayer is something that also is considered to help a soul move on in its journey throughout our lives. And so, one of the ways, if we want to feel connected to those that we love and have died, is on the anniversary of their death, the Yortzeit, which is easy to find, and we can, it's typically the Hebrew date. By saying the Kaddish, there is a belief that it's helping their soul on their journey, and definitely giving charity in someone's memory, tzedakah. All of these things are so beautiful in our tradition, and I just wanted to make sure I shared that as well.
Okay, Marjorie.
Yes, hi, Margie. Thank you so much. In all the work you've done, have you ever sort of noticed in terms of if somebody does in experiencing of grief, is it easier to experience grief over time if there is sort of that image of somebody in the afterlife or meeting your ancestors? I'm speaking out of my own experience, is that I had a loss very, very young in life and never, ever, ever has used the language of afterlife at all. And I'm now just kind of wondering, like, what has that done to me? I'm just fascinated by. I wonder if my grief process would be different if I did have that image. I don't know if it would feel comforting or scary. As you've been talking, I've been really trying to imagine, like, would this person have continued suffering? It seems so complicated. And maybe I've just made it simple by not having that sort of image. Anyways, I just would be interested in what you've learned by hearing people's stories.
So I think it's such a great question. Thank you. I think that is the question. And I think there is no one answer, that each person has their own journey with grief. Grief is a very personal, individual journey. Depending on the own person, their personality, depending on the connection with the person who died. So when I read at the beginning about Art Green, Rabbi Arthur Green from the rabbinical school, his mom died at 11. When he was 11. And he said he grew up with the afterlife. His grandmother came from Poland. He grew up with all those images. He didn't help him. And for him, in order to go forward in life as a young person, he just had to feel the finality of it all. And that helped him at the time. Now he's more open, as he says, that he doesn't know for sure, and he remains agnostic. But so I don't think there is I don't think there's one answer. I think it depends on the person, what they find helpful. And I know that when I've told people that who talk to me about grief over the many, many years, and I say, and I don't, depends on the person what they're sharing with me as well. I would say, I just want to let you know, in case you find comfort in it, we do have a strong belief in the afterlife. Really? I never knew that. Oh, tell me more. Tell me a book I can read. One of the best books, by the way, my favorite book that's really readable, which I'll put in the resources, is, if you're interested, is Does the Soul Survive? And it's written by a conservative rabbi who was a skeptic, didn't believe, and it talks about his personal journey, and then he brings in the tradition. But there's no one right answer. For me, I feel that my mother is at peace. For me, I feel she's not suffering. My mom suffered. She had Alzheimer's. She had mental health issues. It was hard for her in her last few years. I feel, for me, when I was able to be with her in her last 5 days and just be with her and sing to her and say prayers and feel that you're going to see your parents. If it's wishful thinking, it's fine with me. I feel like that was helpful to me, and I feel that it was helpful to my mother, and I find comfort in that. For me, as a young person, to think that this is it freaked me out. I just couldn't imagine. So I don't know, reincarnation, part of the tradition as well. I don't know. For me, it was hard. So that's why I went on this journey to learn all these things. And hopefully to help people. And again, I can't know what a person needs. I can only offer different resources, and then the person themselves finds what they need. All right. And Kathy, yeah, so much more to explore than living on in people's memories, which is also true, of course. I mean, they all become part of us.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. And I really agree with Kathy's comment, which is so much more to consider than just living on in people's memories. Judaism seems to let us explore all possibilities.
Yeah.
So, and you've really presented a wide range. Robert, go right ahead.
Hi there. Thank you, Margie. So my name is Robert Sulliway, and I'm part of the Hevra Kadisha, and I serve and perform. I've done many taharot, and I sort of grew up, thinking that it was strictly ashes to ashes, and then there's no afterlife at all. And I think over the last few years of doing Taharot, I have to say my personal experience is that there's something going on there. There's a little bit of a transition. There's something happening. When you're in the room, you can almost feel the deceased person's soul. It's and this is the first time I've ever really thought about this, and this is the first time I've ever said it, and I need to think more about it, but I just wanted to share that.
I'm so touched that you shared that, Robert. That's really, really, really powerful. And the holy work that you do of the ritual of tahara, of the washing of the body in a very specific way and saying specific prayers, and wrapping up in the tachrichim, the linens, the white linens, all of that is such holy work in our tradition. I just want to honor you for that. And part of that is thinking about the soul moving on to the next world. Part of the prayers are involved in that. Sometimes we don't even know. So thank you for sharing that there is something happening in that room when you are doing that very holy work.
Helene.
Thank you.
To follow what Robert just said, I was, when we lived in Massachusetts, I was on the Death and Bereavement Committee of Temple Emmanuel, and I often volunteered to sit next to the casket before the funeral and read Psalms or other readings. And as Robert says, I often felt I was in dialogue with the person in the casket, and it was a beautiful experience, and I treasured it because very often the children or other loved ones of the person who had died came in, and they also interacted with the casket and with me in a way that I felt we were certainly part of something happening.
Fascinating.
It's so beautiful, and that's it exactly. You both described it so beautifully that, as I read earlier, the soul is sort of around the chibut hakever, the pangs of the grave for 3 to 7 days, and that feeling that you have is so part of our tradition. But when do we talk about this? When do we talk about sightings of people in our bereavement groups? We run bereavement groups in my program. When they feel safe enough, people will share about the feeling of the presence of the spirit of someone who's died, because they're afraid that people will, that's wishful thinking. But it's really common. We don't live in a culture that reinforces that asks people those questions. In cultures where they believe in reincarnation, people talk about it like in daily life. So that's part of what we hear though in our bereavement group. So Nikki wrote, I watched and felt my brother's soul, wow, leave his body at the moment of death. Also with my first daughter, so sorry. I knew her soul wasn't ready or didn't want to be in that human body. So I want to offer,
Wow.
first of all, may their memories all be for a blessing, Nikki. And thank you so much for sharing that experience here with all of us. We're truly honored that you shared that. This is what happens when people open up and share these journeys of the souls with others. You start to hear other people sharing their experiences. Thank you, Robert, for being brave enough to begin the conversation.
Well, the hour is late. Oh, Barbara, do you have a hand up? You sort of look like you have a hand up. Okay. So I just wanted to give everybody a chance. The hour is late, but this has been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot, and I hope others have. So thank you, Margie. And stay tuned. Everybody should be getting a email tomorrow with some resources and information about our next session. So thank you again, and Lila Tov, everybody.
Lala Tov.
Lila
Thank you.
Tov. Good evening.